German MPs, in the meantime, have approved loosening debt rules for defence spending while backing a huge infrastructure investment package. The nation's next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, getting the backing for ambitious plans to loosen the nation's strict debt rules for high defence spending. This as doubts mount about the strength of NATO and the transatlantic alliance. It's also going to set up an enormous fund for investment in its creaking infrastructure. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The
decision we are taking today on defense readiness in a comprehensive sense for our country can therefore be nothing less than the first major step towards a new European defense community, a defense community that also includes countries that are not members of the European Union, but which are very interested in building this common European defense together with us, such as countries like Great Britain and Norway.
Länder wie Großbritannien und das Land Norwegen.
In the meantime, French President Emmanuel Macron is in Berlin to meet the outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He also, we've seen live images there of him arriving, visiting the outgoing Chancellor. He's also earlier today visited the eastern region of l'Aix-les-Bains, which has a military base close to the German border. His visit coming a week after the French leader called for defence spending to be ramped up. Macron announcing that France, as a result, would be ordering more Rafale fighter jets than planned.
L'armée française est à coup sûr l'armée la plus efficace du continent, oui.
France has without a doubt the most effective army on the continent, yes. The best equipped, the most comprehensive and the best trained. But we are pursuing this effort. It was indispensable to repair, to modernize and look ahead. As of the annual address to the army a few weeks ago, I asked our minister and army leadership to go further, and the acceleration of events drove me to take further decisions which are currently being studied. Yes, we're going to increase and accelerate our orders of Rafale jets.
Nous allons accroître et accélérer les commandes de Rafale.
So, what a time to be European. The irony of history being at a time the United States is becoming anything but, meaning more than ever it's the moment for Europe to unify, especially as it realises that depending on its long-time ally is no longer a surefire bet. Timothy Garton Ash is a historian, political writer and Guardian columnist. His book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, has been described as a love letter to Europe, has just been published in French. He happens to be in Paris, and I'm delighted to say the British author joins me now. Timothy, thank you so much for your time. There is a sweet irony, isn't there, that you wrote a book in a country, that being Britain, which turned its back on the EU in 2016.
Well, that's partly the reason I wrote the book, because I had the sense, starting with the Brexit vote, that this Europe that we had built up, this more united Europe, this better Europe, was now in crisis, and that crisis continues in multiple countries. And I think this is it's a series of challenges. Of course, this really the biggest challenge started on the 24th of February 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we already had the Putin shock. Now we have the Trump shock. And if Europe doesn't get its act together now, I don't know when it will.
But the very same forces that threaten European and global stability, excuse me, could indeed bring a sense of true unity, could they not, to the continent as they witness the unravelling of American democracy?
So certainly that's what we see at the moment. It's not just the United States which is saying, hey, you Europeans need to do more for your own defense. That we've known about for years. It's Donald Trump, as you say, attacking the foundations of liberal democracy in the United States, and also explicitly supporting anti-liberal nationalist populist parties in Europe like the AfD, J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, Rassemblement National in this country, those sort of parties. So yes, it's an absolutely frontal challenge to the Europe we built and that I describe in my book Homelands. Look, Yeah, there's tremendous unity among European leaders at the moment. I think there's a real sense this is now we have to get our act together. But translating that into action, for example, in defense, where the reality is that the effective defense of Europe at the moment is still in the American-led NATO.
Are we also witnessing the passing of a generation which experienced global conflict and trauma, and also know that unity is what one needs in order to bring peace? I mean, I think it's certainly something you would find resonates possibly more with older people than with younger people.
Yes. One of the arguments of my book is that there's something that I call the memory engine, which is to say this Europe we have built was built by people who'd experienced, the Second World War, the Holocaust, the Gulag, fascist dictatorship in Spain or Portugal, communist dictatorship in a country like Poland. Those were the people who with this memory engine inside them, drove forward the European process. And now we have, if you're a 30-year-old in France or Italy or Spain, you know nothing but a relatively peaceful, prosperous, and free Europe. But and of course, younger Europeans also voting in significant numbers for those nationalist populist parties. But I think, in my experience, even younger Europeans are waking up to this. The shock coming from the United States, coming from Donald Trump, is really waking people up.
And as you say, this is a critical moment for European leaders as they deal with the threat that is Russia. But is this sort of pie-in-the-sky stuff to create a unified push to defend the continent? I mean, as you write recently, it's one thing to work together on trade policy or product regulation, but a completely different story when it comes to crafting a EU-wide defence strategy.
That's right. And as I say, the reality, the hard stuff, the hardware, the plans, the kit, of European defense is still very much an American-led NATO. So the question is, how do we get as fast as possible from a defense which is essentially in an American-led alliance to a position where Europe can defend itself and Ukraine, by the way, both at the same time, part of the same story. And that it means trying to find out a plan for the Europeanization of NATO, for building up the European parts of NATO, and a defense contribution from the EU, and building up our national defense spending. And then the question is, are our electorates, our voters, in all our different national democracies, going to support that? Are they going to be prepared to pay for it? And that's an absolutely key question. France, for example, is very enthusiastic on this agenda of European defense in the magnificent rhetoric of Emmanuel Macron. But actually, if you look at the hard facts of support for Ukraine or defense spending, it's near the back of the pack. And French voters are really interested in their pensions and their healthcare and their education and so on. So it's a real challenge also to our democracy.
And the chances of doing that is extraordinarily difficult, as you just point out, but also when you have the likes of Hungary's Viktor Orban.
Well, that means you can't do it all through the EU because he's a veto player in the EU. So increasingly what we're seeing is, coalitions of the willing, groups of European countries coming together at a meeting summoned by Keir Starmer in London or by Emmanuel Macron in Paris or wherever it may be. And it's interesting, Friedrich Merz, the incoming Chancellor of Germany, is going to be a very important player in all of this. He's talked repeatedly about having a contact group of Germany, France, Poland, and Britain to take this whole conversation forward. I think it's going to be complicated, but then Europe has always been complicated.
But, the difference between this period versus the time of Churchill and Charles de Gaulle is you didn't have social media. You also had a sense of people's coalescing around one strong individual. That doesn't seem to be so much the case in Europe when there's so many competing interests. And as you also pointed out, how do you get Europeans on board when you've got 15-year-olds out in the streets of Paris, campaigning against a pension reform? How do you get that message across?
Yeah, it needs a lot of leadership, a lot of persuasion, and of course, That's what our politicians haven't done over the last 30 years. I've been advocating something I call Churchillo-Gaullism, a combination of Churchill and de Gaulle, and both of them, of course, were great speakers, great orators, great actors, as well as great fighters. So that's certainly something it needs. But I also quote in that article you mentioned a remarkable comment that Churchill made when de Gaulle awarded him the Croix de la Libération, the Liberation Cross, in 1958. And Churchill said, it's particularly difficult to get this kind of unity of effort when you're in a situation that is neither war nor peace, but somewhere in between. And that's exactly where we are in most of Europe at the moment. Ukraine is at war. Its eastern neighbors have a strong sense they're at war. Poland, for example, the Baltic states. But by the time you get to Spain or Portugal or even France or Italy, there's not that sense of urgency and immediate threat.
Timothy Garton Ash, it's been a delight speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be with you.